Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. Time, relentless, unstoppable, and always moving forward. Time affects everything, and there's a clock ticking in all of us. We get reminded of it with each passing year, like the one we are just about to finish. Not surprisingly, perhaps, time also plays a crucial role in computing. Whether it's the time it takes for a program to run, or the moment we get impatient, or perhaps even annoyed in case it takes a long while to start up our favorite app. But where do computers get their time from? And how are they kept in sync with other computers? And why does it even matter? How to keep track of time and how to make sure that clocks on different computers agree with each other on what time it is has occupied the minds of many brilliant computer scientists and engineers. And amongst them, one person stands out, David Mills, from the University of Delaware in the US. Born in 1938 in Oakland, California, David Mills dedicated his work and energy on creating the Network Time Protocol, or NTP for short, to keep computer clocks on the straight and narrow. Sadly, David Mills' own time came to an end when he passed away on the 17th of January this year, 2024, but his creation lives on, and for this reason, I want to dedicate this episode, the last of this 8th season of Code for Thought and the last one for 2024, to this and his important contribution. David Mills was, of course, not alone in this. He found a very keen collaborator in Harlan Stenn, who has been working with David Mills for a very long time on NTP. Harlan keeps the effort going, not least with the Network Time Foundation, a foundation he created. I was fortunate enough, very fortunate indeed, to grab a bit of Harlan's time and talk about NTP and his collaboration with David Mills. Harlan and I met earlier in 2024, and here he takes us through the way the Network Time Protocol evolved. Hi, Harlan.
Hello, Peter. Thank you for having me here.
I'm very excited to meet you today. We're going to talk about the Network Time Protocol, but actually we're also talking a little bit about David Mills, aren't we?
Yes.
Because David Mills sadly passed away early this year, and he's very closely related to the Network Time Protocol.
That was his baby.
Exactly. Yeah, and you can look it up, actually. I think there's a very nice Wikipedia page. And obviously, he still has his page. I think it was University of Delaware, wasn't it?
That's correct.
Speaking.
And we have a copy of all of that at Network Time Foundation's website also.
Indeed, because you're now the president of the Network Time Foundation, aren't you?
That is true.
That sounds like a sigh.
Well, I mean, that and $5 will get you a cup of coffee.
Harlan, do you remember how David Mills actually get to start working on Network Time Protocol?
My understanding was back in the very early days of the internet, the first problem they wanted to solve was routing protocols. And there were two camps of which way to go. And Dave did not pick the side that won. Since the winning group took their approach and ran with it, Dave says, great, what's some other interesting problem I'd like to work on? And he realized that time synchronization was critical and nobody wanted to touch it. And the more he looked at it, the more he realized it was an incredibly difficult problem to solve. So somewhere around 1980, I think it may have been, unless it was a little sooner, he started working on that and produced a couple of papers that talked about how to synchronize time on computers over distance, for lack of a better phrase, and got that working and published it. And very shortly thereafter, that went from the research stage to let's do this on the ARPANET and get involved in it that way. And so he published the very first NTP quote unquote specification. And I'm sorry, I don't have the dates offhand. It may have been around 1981 or so. And that was just a few page document, and very quickly came out with an RFC that I think was they called version 1, which meant the first version was really version 0.
Right. Yeah.
And version 1 came out, and that lasted a little bit of time. And then they came out with version 2. Dave and folks started working on NTP version 3. And since that was experimental at that point, they decided that the version 2 software was called NTPD. So they called the version 3 software XNTPD for experimental
Oh, right.
NTPD. Except version 3 lasted for a real long time, relatively speaking. And then as we were winding out of 1999, it may have been 95, I don't remember, but I started working on it probably sometime in the 90s. And somewhere around there, I kept asking Dave, why is there an X in the name? And he said, we did it originally because people were running version 2, and we wanted to make sure they could run version 3 without stepping on anybody's toes. And so the X really doesn't belong there anymore. But since we're looking at version 4, Harlan, when you release version 4, let's get rid of the X in the name. We have a release timeline page at ntp.org. We talk about when the first alpha or beta release happened, because I don't have very good dates on some of the alpha and beta releases for version 4. But Dave wanted to release version 4 without the X. And the primary reason for version 4 was to allow extension fields. And the primary reason for extension fields at that time was AutoKey, which was a way to do ephemeral key exchange to authenticate NTP packets. And there was a very specific use case for the government.
The network time protocol, people may not think about it, really. We take it for granted that computers synchronize, but actually, as you said right at the beginning, it's not that simple, is it?
It's not easy at all.
And exactly. What are the complexities? Give us a flavor of why it's difficult.
For starters, there are several ways to try to synchronize time on computers. One of them is to decide, I want to know what time it is, so I'm going to find somebody I'm willing to believe and follow them. And that was an approach taken by not NTP back in the late 1990s. And Dave's approach was, I'm going to ask a bunch of people what time they think it is. I'm going to look at their answers, and I'm going to choose the best answers I can. And of the best answers I can find, I'm going to determine my idea of the best time from these sources, and I'm going to steer towards it.
That sounds complex.
Well, it's a little more complex, but it means you're not, playing follow the leader while the leader drives you off the cliff. Not to throw a wrench in the works, but when we released version 4 software, we stopped supporting the version 3 software. So people were running the version 4 software around 1999, 2000. There was no standard for it. We started the standards process at that time, but the very first standard for NTP version 4 didn't happen until 2007. So there were 7 years there where they were working on the standard, but the code was out there and people were using it.
It's quite a long time, actually, because you mentioned that David Mills started working sort of in the 70s and then the first release maybe in the 1980s. And here we are talking about standardization 20 years later.
Oh, yeah. People are talking about a version 5 protocol. And I think I'll call that a hot potato because there's some controversy around that. The problem with network time is it's more than the protocol. The protocol just tells you what is simply information about a single timestamp. The trick about time synchronization is what do you do with that? And NTP versions 1, 2, 3, and 4 included algorithms. What do you do with this data that you've got? How do you decide what to listen to and what not to listen to? How do you value it? What are some of the problems that you can get into? And the algorithms are a critical component of the fact that it works. And we had people back then saying, let's separate the protocol from the algorithms. Dave and a bunch of others fought tooth and nail against that. Because if all you get is the data and you're free to do anything you want with it and interpret it in any way, if you choose a different set of algorithms, your behavior will not be the same as what everybody else is doing. And when you're dealing with loops of systems trying to collaborate and come up with the best use of time, somebody who doesn't play by the rules can basically cause the wheels to fly off the bus.
So what we're talking about is not just standardizing the data, sort of the protocol data, but also the way you handle them, the algorithms.
Exactly.
I'd like to pause for a bit because there's quite a lot in this short conversation that I feel we need to unpick. As we've just heard, syncing the time between computers is actually quite tricky. It starts with, what time should computers actually sync with? You might know the answer, but it's not an immediately obvious one. At the time I record this, here in London, it is 10 o'clock in the morning, which means that in Paris or Berlin it's 11 a.m., whereas in New York on the East Coast in the US it would be 5 a.m. So taking our time is not a particularly useful one. Luckily, there is a convention of an agreed reference time. And it is set and agreed by the International Telecommunication Union in one of its recommendations. The time in question is called Coordinated Universal Time and is abbreviated as UTC, which is probably how you know about it. This time, the definition of it and how it is evolving makes for an interesting episode in its own right. Suffice to say that UTC is a global time and independent of geographical location. Now that we have a time we can agree on, let's look at the clocks and how they share their time with each other. What we need for that are a bunch of reference clocks we can fall back on, and for that and other reasons, the NTP network architecture is organized in a hierarchy of levels. Each level is called a stratum. The top one, level 0 or stratum 0, has high-precision clocks such as atomic clocks. They are primary time servers, our reference clocks, so to speak. The next level down on stratum 1, NTP servers attach to stratum 0 machines to sync their time. They can also check with peers from stratum 1 for backup or sanity checks. And so it goes on with further strata downstream, where each stratum is attached to the one above. There can be up to 15 strata in total, I believe. Messages between NTP servers are sent in packets via the Transport Control Protocol Internet Protocol, or TCP/IP for short, or indeed the User Datagram Protocol, or UDP. The messages will contain a timestamp, which comes in a format specified by NTP. In fact, there are two timestamp formats, a short 32-bit one and a longer 64-bit one. In both cases, the values are unsigned integers, where the first half is the number of seconds and the other half the fractions. So for the long 64-bit timestamp, you get 32 bits for the number of seconds and the remaining 32 bits for fractions. But how many seconds and from when exactly? When did this particular clock start ticking? And for how long will it go? Well, the answer to that question is the epoch. And we can put a time limit for an epoch. If we take the long form of the timestamp, we know that there are at most 32 bits for seconds. And if you convert that into years, you end up with a limit of 136 years, which is the length of an epoch. And so, timestamps are mapped to epochs, and the very first of its kind, the base date, the count 0 epoch of all, is dated to the 1st of January 1900. Which means we are still at the end of recording in the foundation epoch, right until 2036, when the next epoch, epoch number 1, will kick off. The messages exchanged in packets between NTP servers and clients contain, of course, a lot more than just the timestamps, like certificates for securing messages, etc. The interesting bit is what happens with these messages. As Harlan said earlier, NTP is not just specifying the timestamp and the message format being exchanged between servers. It also says something about what you do with it. And this takes us straight to the way NTP aligns the clocks between machines, the so-called pair and pole processes. They are described and specified in detail in the current NTP specification of version 4. In essence, an NTP client checks the time or polls the time from one or more NTP servers on the network in regular intervals. The delay and time offset between the clocks is measured and checked with clock filtering algorithms. And as Harlan said, it looks at the time from each one and picks the one it trusts most. The process of all of that proves to be quite robust, even if it may take a while to establish a good answer. And if you're interested, the show notes contain a link to a presentation from David Mills himself, and the pages, of course, from the Network Time Foundation that give you further details. Okay, I've gone a little bit into the weeds on this one, so let's go back to David Mills and his collaboration with Harlan Stenn. As you've heard, Harlan worked with David Mills for a very long time. But the US is a big country, and at the time, Harlan and David were actually not in the same place. So I wanted to find out how all of that worked, bearing in mind that this was the days before Zoom, before Git and GitHub, and all the other amenities that we take for granted these days. How did you get involved? Because I think there is the story that you've actually never met, or you almost met, but you've been working together for quite some time.
Dave and I worked together for 30 some odd years, and we never met. We had a lot of phone calls. I probably exchanged well over 10,000 emails with a guy.
How did that start then?
I was working for a company in St. Louis that did radiation treatment planning software. And their software ran on, I'm making a guess here, 4 or 5 different vendors' hardware. And they ran their software on every supported version of Unix that every one of those vendors had, which meant we had a decent-sized laboratory of hardware on site. When you're developing software for that many machines, you quickly learn you have to have NFS so you can have a single copy of your software. And when you want to make a change, you can then very quickly build it on all these platforms without having to copy it around. Because if you make a change for one machine and you don't propagate that correctly to every other instance of the software, you've got bit rot and you lose changes and it's horrible. We were using NFS to build all of our software. The trick is if you're using NFS to build your software, that means the clock on the NFS server has to be very well synchronized to the clock on your client machine. Right. So my first job there was to make sure that we had proper time synchronization on all the computers. At the time, as I recall, each vendor solved it their own way, and it didn't work between vendors. So I started looking at solutions to keep the clock synchronized these machines. There were 2 contenders at the time. One of them was the version I mentioned that said, you tell me who to believe and I will follow them. Yeah. And that didn't impress me as a particularly, I'm going to say high quality, but it wasn't a robust solution.
What was that called, that solution?
I don't want to say.
Okay.
Because it's been too long. I know what it was and I know who wrote it. I don't want to cause any trouble. The people who designed it had a use case for it, and it clearly satisfied their use case. My use case wasn't theirs. So when I looked at it and I saw that version and I saw NTP, I said, I like the way NTP self-heals, looks at everything, and constantly evaluates and evolves what's the best source of time and does it. It knows how to talk to reference clocks. It can use a real modem over our real copper wire phone lines to call home to NIST and get a very accurate timestamp. So since NTP was open source and I didn't have to worry about finding a copy of the other guy's software and trying to find a way to port it everywhere, we just started going with NTP. And since the collection of machines we had wasn't the same as what Dave had at UDEL, I started sending Dave patches.
But by email, or how did you do
that? Oh, yes, exactly. I would email him patches and he would merge them and then he would make his releases. At the time, when you got your NTP software, you got the tarball, you unpacked it into a directory, you hand edited the make file to choose the parts you wanted and specify the compiler and any extra bits of software you needed to get it to build. And then you hand edited the config.h file to deal with your operating system specific vagaries. And that was miserable. And about that time I said, hey, Dave, you've installed some of these GNU utilities. would you like it if NTP had a configure script and could build in a subdirectory so you'd have a single copy of your source code and you could build it on all the different platforms? And he said, yes, that would be great.
I'm quite interested in that because that was in the days before Zoom. I mean, we've been through the pandemic and people started working with Zoom and
this
all
was
of
in the
that.
late 90s.
Exactly. That was in the late 90s, but none of this existed. So how was that actually working?
It was easy. I mean, as I said, we would send several emails back and forth every day.
So how did you then take NTP and convince people to actually use that? So
We didn't have to convince people. They were using it already. So they would just grab the tarball and they lived with the fact they had to manually edit it. Somewhere in the mid 90s, I asked Dave if he'd like me to change it so that it would no more hand editing of the files and you could build them a subdirectory. And he said, that would be great. Somewhere in the release timeline page, it talks about when I did my AutoConf conversion. And what basically happened is Dave said, go. And that was probably on a Friday night. And 2 weeks later, I said, I've got something for you to look at. I sent him a tarball. He looked at it and said, gee, that's great. Why don't I give you a login on my machine so we can collaborate easier? And I don't remember if that happened before this or right about that time, but he gave me a login on the machine. And that meant that he expected me to put my patches on his machine and incorporate them and then point them at the new directory.
That meant system or root admin?
Not yet. It meant that I had a user account and Dave could get it. You know, because I didn't have root on Dave's machine. Dave had root on Dave's machines, and apparently a couple of the most senior admins at University of Delaware had root on Dave's machine. Nobody else had it. I didn't realize the significance of that until about 10 years later. I got to the point where I'd made a change and I built it and said, Dave, it's all ready to go. All you got to do is install it and run it. And you know that has to be done by root, and I don't have root access. And Dave said, oh, I'll send you the password. And at that point, he did, and I started doing that, you know, installing and testing it. And right as I finished the AutoConf configuration, Dave said, I didn't want to step on your toes, so I haven't applied any patches to the code base since you started this conversion 2 weeks ago. There are some patches that are in the queue. Would you mind applying them? I said, not a problem. And the next thing I know, I'm the project manager and I'm the one who does all the patches. And Dave is the one who deals with the 3 most sensitive files in the distribution. And he thinks of all the algorithms and does that stuff. And I deal with all the stuff he doesn't want to, including fixing typos and documentation and working with ancillary scripts that aren't as sensitive or critical as the stuff he messed with, which was great for him. And I sure didn't mind because it meant he was able to focus exclusively on getting things like NTP version 4 out the door and algorithmic improvements and the rest of it.
So that's how you got to the root privileges on Dave's machine.
And I didn't think about it much, and it didn't mean that much to me because I'd already been doing sysadmin and stuff like that for more than 20 years by that time. And I've got root on machines all over the place. It didn't make a difference to me. And I didn't think about this until one day I was working with one of Dave's grad students on a problem, and we had just fixed it. And he says, well, now we got to call Dave to install it. And I said, why? And he says, well, because we have to be root to install it. And Dave has root. And I said, I have root. And the guy froze and said, what do you mean you have root? I said, Dave gave me root on his machine so I could install this. And the guy froze again and said, you have root on Dave's machines? And I said, yeah, what's the big deal? And he says, nobody has root on Dave's machine except Dave and the 2 or 3 top sysadmins in university IT. Nobody has access to that stuff, not his grad students, not his teaching assistants, nobody. But you have it? And I went, yeah, is that a big deal? And he went, yeah, that's a big deal.
Yes.
So I went, okay, but I've got it, so I'm perfectly happy to do this, and we got it installed, and what can I tell you?
Well, that was remote working 1990s style. In today's world, you may want to think again when sharing a root password. But I can appreciate that 20, 30 or more years ago, there may not have been that many options. Anyway, before Harlan and I ended our chat, I wanted to quiz him on the foundation he created. You're the president of the Network Time Foundation, so obviously the work continues. So what's next on the list for you then?
The first thing I'm going to say is back in the 90s, I knew we needed to have some way for the NTP project to receive funds and equipment. And Dave's point was that's easy. Tell people to give it to the University of Delaware. And we looked into that, and UDEL said, we are happy to receive any donations of money and or equipment anybody wants to give us. And a voice in my head said, probe that. And I did. And I said, what, if any, assurance do we have that if somebody donates money or equipment to the NTP project to UDEL, that UDEL will actually give it there? And they said, none, we'll use it wherever we want. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I realized there had to be a legal entity specifically designed to support the NTP project. So I was all set to create the NTP Foundation. And about that time, Precision Time Protocol was on the horizon. And that was clearly not NTP. It worked at a lower level of the network and things like that. But I also remembered that once upon a time, Wells Fargo was a stagecoach company.
Right, yeah.
Except they weren't in the stagecoach business. They were in the transportation business. Specifically, they transported money around. So it was easy for them to become a bank. So with just a few days thought, I said, I don't want to create an NTP foundation. I want to create a network time foundation that will handle the NTP project. It'll handle the PTP projects. It'll be there to handle any sort of time-related functions around networking.
So the NTP Foundation is keeping the important work that David Mills started going. And if you think of supporting their efforts, go to the webpage given in the show notes. We're coming to the end of this episode now. I hope that you enjoyed our little excursion into the world of measuring and synchronizing time and clocks, and I hope you appreciate and remember the work David Mills created. As I said in an earlier episode, David Mills is not the only computing pioneer we lost in 2024. Earlier this season, I remembered Niklas Wirth and the work he did, for instance, with programming languages like Pascal. And in November, we lost Thomas Kurtz, who co-created BASIC, the programming language. And while we're on the subject of pioneers, I'd like to shine a light on yet another one who passed away in 2024, a pioneer in contemporary and electronic and minimal music, Phill Niblock, whose sounds you've been listening to throughout this episode. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the last episode for the season 8 of Code for Thought. I'm going to try and have a little break over the festive season and the New Year's Eve and day period, and I hope you do too. Code for Thought will be back in the middle of January with a new season, new material, new interviews, and new insights, all of which I hope will catch your interest. And the German and French language episodes will of course continue in the next season too, with the first German episode on the 28th of January and the first French one on the 11th of February. Until then, I hope you have a chance to recharge your batteries and can enjoy some time off. And if nothing else, I wish you all the best for the next year 2025. Be kind to one another. And see you in January. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.